Sign the removal petition or pack your things, my aunt said, sliding papers across the table as relatives watched me stand. My chair was taken away. Then the clerk called my name. My name is Samantha Reed. I'm 39 years old. I work as a medical billing specialist at a regional healthcare network, and my entire job revolves around precision and persistence in navigating complex paperwork and insurance claims. For the past 6 years, I managed my late mother's home, handled her bills, coordinated her insurance during 2 rounds of cancer treatment, and kept everything running while my siblings stayed completely absent from her daily life. My family labeled me just the helper, someone useful for managing logistics, but never important enough to include in actual family decisions. I live modestly in a small rental when I'm not at my mother's house, and I sacrificed 2 different job promotions that would have required relocating to other cities because I chose to remain nearby during her illness. My family values louder, wealthier relatives who show up to holiday dinners with expensive gifts and stories about vacations, not the person who handles the unglamorous work of medical appointments and medication schedules. I avoided conflict for years, believing that service and care would eventually be recognized and appreciated. After my mother passed away 4 months ago, relatives I barely knew quickly took control of everything, treating me like a temporary guest in the home where I'd been living and caring for her. I wasn't rich or glamorous, never made dramatic gestures or demanded attention at family gatherings, but I had something they didn't expect. I had complete documentation of residency, payment records, and legal occupancy rights that couldn't be disputed or erased. If you've been overlooked despite doing all the real work, this is for you. If you've been pushed aside by family decisions after carrying the responsibility, subscribe and share your story in the comments. This is about quiet responsibility versus loud entitlement. Click like or hype if you believe documentation and truth matter. The family meeting was framed as an estate discussion, a gathering to talk about next steps and honor my mother's memory. The dining room smelled like the lavender cleaner I'd used that morning, trying to make everything perfect. But when everyone arrived, I realized immediately this wasn't a discussion. It was an intervention. My Aunt Patricia stood at the head of the table with a leather folder, pulling out official-looking documents and setting them in front of each relative. She announced that she'd filed a legal petition to remove me from the property, claiming I was a non-resident occupant with no legal right to stay. The humiliation was immediate and public. My cousin removed my place setting from the table while I watched, setting the plate and silverware on the kitchen counter like I was being uninvited mid-gathering. Another relative began stacking my mail into a cardboard box, handling my personal correspondence in front of everyone. My aunt's voice was cold and certain. "You were helping out, Samantha. Nobody's saying you didn't do that, but helping doesn't mean you live here. You have your own apartment." I tried to present property tax receipts I'd paid for 3 years, documents I'd brought specifically in case this happened. Patricia waved them away dismissively. "That's basically rent. You stayed here sometime, so you contributed. It doesn't give you ownership." Neighbors from next door had been invited, ostensibly to hear about memorial plans. Now they were witnessing my public removal. Mrs. Chen stood near the doorway, her expression uncomfortable but silent. My cousin James handed me a printed notice stating I had 14 days to vacate the premises or face legal eviction. My hands shook as I held the paper. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The petition included sworn statements from relatives claiming I'd abandoned the property months before my mother's death, that I'd only returned after she passed. The statements were dated and notarized. They were also completely fabricated. The betrayals accelerated over the following days, each one more calculated than the last. First came physical exclusion. I returned to the house the next morning to find the locks had been changed. My key didn't work. My belongings had been moved from my bedroom to boxes stacked in the garage, accessible only if someone let me in. I stood on the front porch and knocked, feeling like a stranger at the home where I'd lived for years. When my uncle finally opened the door, he told me I couldn't enter without supervision, that the family was protecting the estate. I showed him my driver's license listing this address. He closed the door anyway. Second came the public smear campaign. Posts appeared on social media from extended family members about people who try to claim property that doesn't belong to them. Cautionary tales about manipulative relatives who exploit elderly family members. They never used my name, but the timing and context made it obvious. A coworker pulled me aside during lunch and asked carefully if everything was okay, if there was truth to rumors about me trying to fraudulently claim someone's house. The shame was overwhelming. Third, the legal manipulation intensified in ways I didn't expect. Relatives filed additional sworn affidavits with the court, statements from cousins I barely knew claiming they'd visited regularly and never seen me there, implying I was lying about living in the house. Utility accounts I'd managed for years were mysteriously backdated, altered to show my aunt's name as the primary account holder going back 18 months, erasing all evidence of my payments and responsibility. The paper trail I'd relied on was being systematically dismantled. But something shifted in me during those days of humiliation and exclusion. The hurt didn't disappear, but it transformed into something colder and more focused. I stopped trying to argue with relatives or defend myself in group chats. I started compiling evidence instead. I retrieved certified tax records directly from the county assessor's office, documents that couldn't be altered or backdated. I pulled residency verification from my employer's HR files, proof that I'd listed this address for years. I gathered medical insurance forms naming this house as my primary address. I collected every piece of documentation that existed outside my family's control. My emotional state changed from devastated to determined. I wasn't going to beg or plead. I was going to let the system work the way it was designed to work. What my family didn't know, what they'd failed to discover in their rush to remove me, was that I had years of certified records and notarized occupancy documents that existed in official systems they couldn't touch. I'm a medical billing specialist. My entire career is built on understanding how to navigate bureaucratic systems and maintain documentation that survives audits and legal challenges. I had saved every email exchange where relatives explicitly refused caregiving responsibilities, messages where they declined to help with my mother's appointments or medications because they were too busy or too far away. I had a recorded voicemail my mother left me 18 months before she died, during a moment of clarity between treatments. Her voice was weak, but her words were deliberate. "Samantha, this is your home. I want you here. Don't let anyone tell you different after I'm gone." I'd saved it because I missed her voice. Now it was legal evidence. I had insurance documents, official forms filed with my healthcare provider and my mother's doctors, all listing this house as my primary address going back 5 years. I also did something my family never expected. I filed a quiet motion with the probate court challenging the removal petition on the grounds of fraudulent statements and improper legal procedure. I didn't announce it. I didn't tell anyone in the family. I just submitted the paperwork through proper legal channels and waited. I had a plan they never saw coming. The person who made the difference was Mr. Kaplan, my mother's longtime attorney who'd handled her affairs for over 20 years. He contacted me 3 days after I received the removal notice, asking to meet privately at a coffee shop away from family interference. The space was crowded and loud, filled with the hiss of espresso machines and conversations I couldn't quite hear. We sat at a corner table and he spread documents between us, his weathered hands moving carefully over papers. "Samantha, I've reviewed the removal petition your aunt filed," he said, his voice low and serious. "There are significant inconsistencies here. The sworn statements contradict county records and tax filings." He explained that my aunt had used an outdated power of attorney to file the petition, authority that expired when my mother died. He advised me to let the court process expose the problems naturally rather than engaging in family arguments. Don't give them anything to use against you. Let the evidence speak. Meanwhile, my family grew increasingly arrogant with their assumed victory. My aunt hired contractors to evaluate renovation costs, discussing plans to update the kitchen and bathrooms before listing the property for sale. Cousins posted about their anticipated shares of the proceeds, talking openly about what they'd do with the money. My brother, who hadn't visited in 3 years, made comments about finally being able to afford a down payment on a house of his own. They discussed profit distribution like it was already settled, already done. Samantha stayed completely silent through all of it. I didn't respond to posts or messages. I didn't argue or defend myself. I just continued documenting everything they said publicly, screenshotting conversations. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, with wooden benches that creaked when people shifted their weight and fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. The smell of floor walks and old paper filled the air. My aunt sat with her attorney, a young man in an expensive suit who looked bored and slightly annoyed to be handling what he clearly thought was a simple eviction case. Several relatives filled the gallery behind them, there to support Patricia and witness what they assumed would be my final removal. I sat on the opposite side with Mr. Kaplan, who'd brought 3 expanding folders full of documentation. The judge entered and we all stood. She was middle-aged with gray streaks in her dark hair and reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck. My aunt's attorney spoke first, arguing that I was a temporary occupant who'd overstayed my welcome after providing occasional caregiving. He presented the sworn affidavits from relatives claiming I'd never actually lived there, that I'd had my own apartment and only visited. Miss Reed is attempting to claim property through false residency claims, he said smoothly. The family has been more than patient, but now seeks proper legal removal. Then Mr. Kaplan stood. He methodically presented certified property tax payments showing my name and bank account information going back 3 years, residency records from the county registrar's office, medical insurance documents listing this address as my primary residence for 5 years, employment records from my healthcare network showing the same address on file. Then he played the voicemail. My mother's voice filled the courtroom, weak but unmistakable, saying I belonged in that house and not to let anyone tell me different. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. The judge leaned forward, listening intently. Mr. Kaplan continued, presenting evidence that the sworn affidavits contained false information that contradicted official records. He showed the court that utility accounts had been backdated illegally, that my aunt had used expired legal authority to file the removal petition. The judge began asking pointed questions. Miss Patterson, when did you last verify the residency status of the person you're seeking to remove? My aunt stammered something about family knowledge. The judge looked unimpressed. And these utility records showing account holder changes, can you explain the discrepancy in dates? Patricia's attorney had no good answer. I spoke then, my voice steady and cold despite the adrenaline flooding through me. Your Honor, they didn't try to remove a tenant who'd overstayed. They tried to erase a resident who had legal standing and documentation they couldn't ignore. The judge reviewed documents silently for what felt like an eternity. Then she removed her glasses and looked directly at my aunt. This court finds the removal petition to be based on false statements and improperly filed using expired authority. The petition is dismissed. She paused. Furthermore, given the evidence of fraudulent affidavits and document manipulation, this court is ordering an investigation into the filings. Then she did something I hadn't expected. Miss Patterson, you are removed as a state administrator due to misconduct in these proceedings. The court will appoint an interim administrator pending full probate review. The authority in that room shifted instantly. My aunt's confident expression crumbled. Relatives in the gallery exchanged shocked glances. The certainty they'd all shared evaporated in seconds. I was reinstated as the legal resident of the property by court order the following week, with full rights restored immediately. The court appointed me interim estate administrator pending formal probate, which meant every decision about the property now required my approval and documentation. The planned property sale was halted. The fraudulent filings submitted by my relatives triggered an official investigation that could result in perjury charges. My family fractured almost immediately. My aunt blamed the attorney for not verifying information. My cousins blamed my aunts for rushing the process. My brother, who'd been so confident about his share, quietly stopped posting about the property altogether. Some relatives attempted awkward apologies, phone calls where they claimed they'd been misled or hadn't understood what was really happening. Others simply disappeared, blocking me on social media and avoiding any mention of the situation. I restored the house carefully, honoring my mother's wishes and preserving the home she loved. I kept her furniture, maintained her garden, stayed in the room where I'd cared for her during her final months. I reflected often during those weeks about the power of silence backed by evidence, about how systems designed to protect truth actually work when you understand how to use them properly. I learned that being erased on paper doesn't erase the reality you lived, and that documentation speaks louder than any family narrative. They tried to remove me from my home, using legal papers and false statements and public humiliation, but the truth, preserved in records they couldn't alter and systems they didn't understand, removed them instead. If you've been excluded from your own home or falsely labeled an outsider in a place you built your life, you know exactly how isolating that feels. Share your story in the comments about eviction attempts or property disputes where family tried to rewrite history. Stand firm with documentation and truth. Subscribe to join a community that values fairness over intimidation and evidence over assumptions. Click hype to help this story reach others who desperately need to hear it. Standing up for yourself is tough,